it's not me. Start up in Somalis and bicycle all the way down here to Berkeley and come around to every one of your living units and say, Nubia, I want you to find out about the Maldives. Would you pass the word? Obviously that would not work. Of course, web is terrific. It does work rather well for people with whom you cannot communicate in any other way. So if you have the good sense to use it in that category, it has enhanced communication. But the minute you use it to substitute for a more personal form of communication, a letter, a telephone call, God forbid, personal contact, then you're letting the technology replace you as a person. And I have a slide that I sometimes show, except people have told me it's too depressing. It's an ad for a brand new bright red sports car, which attracted my attention. Okay, I admit it. I looked at the ad, and it shows it's this oscilloscope readout, which is an absolute sync. And the top line says heart rate. It's the driver's heart rate, and diastolic, systolic, diastolic, systolic. And on the bottom it says it's the engine RPMs, and they're absolutely in sync. And then they join. It's one beat. And then it says, don't just drive the car, be the car. And personally, I think this is where we have been driven to this point of letting machines play such a large part in our life that on a certain level, we think that we are machines. And that happens to be drastically wrong. Mike? Yes, he said. Mm-hmm.
Technology should serve human beings, not the other way around.
Yes, so this is essentially what I'm saying. If you use the tool with your intelligence to fulfill a legitimate function, it will not cause any problem. But there will come a point where human beings have apparently some kind of what they used to call target fascination. This thing that happened in World War II, you would go to dive bomb somebody, which you shouldn't be doing in the first place. But you get so fascinated that you forget what you were doing and you just crash into them. That often enough happened that they had a name for the syndrome, target fascination. In the Bhagavad Gita it says, whatever you dwell on, you will have a desire for and eventually you will identify with. It's a very profound principle. So to use anything with detachment, I imagine, would not get us into difficulty. But when the thing starts dictating its own purposes, then it gets difficult. So, oh, I remember now. This was Shannon's question. Okay, yeah, about technology. So this is clearly part of our task, which is, I think the only way we can go about it is to reconnect humanly on such a deep level that machines will be boring, which is what they basically are. And even for someone who has a somewhat immature approach like me, even a very, very glitzy machine will look like just a machine. I remember in the early days of computers when they weren't all that glitzy, Ishran, who I just mentioned, was being shown a room full of computers, and the person showing them to him said, these computers can do everything that you can do. That was a mistake. Ishran immediately said, they cannot meditate. So we have to get away from that fascination with technology, which ultimately is fascination with the material world. And I don't think there's any other way of doing it other than reconnecting with ourselves humanly. And I was very struck by something that Mickey said, connection is the key, reaching for the core of the other person within myself. She said that almost without realizing what she had said. The core of the other person within myself. I meant to bring that up to her over lunch. Okay, I'm sorry that this is one of those days where we have a number of little different things to fill in, but we're just trying to sketch in the picture. So there's another conflict-reducing mechanism which interestingly straddles the constructive and obstructive lines that I wanted to bring up here as a possible element in the whole picture of a new culture. And that's, again, something which was discovered by serendipity. And when it was discovered that it works very well, it has started to spread. And this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was started in South Africa because you had a situation of appalling dehumanization, absolutely appalling, one of the worst in the world, up to that time anyway. And it had been voted out of power. And at that time, people were saying that if South Africa could solve its problem, the whole continent would be solvable. And I think in theory that that's still true. But they discovered that once they had changed the power structure, that it did very little to change the human dynamic on the ground. So, I mean, for us, this is no big surprise, right? But they had to discover that experientially. And it was a revolution that came about through largely nonviolent means. It had gone through several phases. Went from nonviolence, relapsed into violence after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, but by the time Mandela was released, he was able to get it back on a nonviolent track, and it was mainly done through boycotts and things like that. So the basis was there, and there had to be a way of bringing those two communities together. And there's more than two communities in South Africa, but for convenience, we would say Europeans and Africans. And the dehumanization had been drastic, and you needed some way of bringing them back together. What they came up with was basically a kind of victim-offender reconciliation program on the large-scale political level. If you have to go, Carrie, I won't say anything intelligent after this. And the system was pretty simple. Interestingly, incidentally, there's an interesting film about this called Long Night's Journey into Day. It's a very moving film. And what they did was they allowed people to publicly admit their crimes, and they would then be pardoned. So all you had to do was get up and say, yes, I did it. And it was amazingly helpful in many ways. I mean, you had mothers who had no idea what had happened to their children, to their sons. And here you have somebody who had been a police captain, and he would say, yeah, we lured those children into a combi and drove it off into the country and blew it up. So it's not like you're giving them a whole lot, right? But at least they can go to the spot where their child died, and at least somebody got up and said, yes, something happened to you. And it's very minimal, right? They're not even saying, I did it and I'm sorry in many cases. All I had to do was say I did it. And in fact, in some of the scenes in this movie, you'll see on both sides, black and white people saying, yes, I participated in this crime. That's what it seemed like we should be doing in those days. Here's why. And not even really expressing any remorse. Hang on just a second. And so then this enabled them to get the country functioning together enough that it could write a constitution and start moving forward. And in some ways, it's been very encouraging and very inspiring even and progressive. I remember hearing from a famous Jewish white South African who was a lawyer, and he actually had been bombed in his car and lost one arm, and he's now on the Supreme Court in South Africa, and he's saying, we are writing pro-human rights decisions every day of the week in that court. It used to be that the United States, South Africa, and China were executing more people than any other industrialized country in the world, and South Africa dropped out, leaving us neck and neck with China for that signal honor. So in some ways it has been very, very successful, and it was imitated or replicated in Guatemala and in the Balkans and many other parts of the world with certain variations matching local conditions and certain variations just because the thing also was not perfect and we need to have a look at improving it. So let's take your comment, and then I want to ask everyone, how could you improve this system?
What was the meeting to do?
In court. It was a courtroom. They're doing it. It would be public, and a lot of it was televised and so forth. But it was oral.
People volunteer themselves?
Yeah, because at this point you are now a criminal. If you there's one element I forgot to mention. It had to be a political crime. If you robbed somebody or you killed them just because you were in a bad mood, you still were criminal and criminally liable. But if you killed someone or whatever you did in a political context, you could get pardoned for that by public admission. So that's the truth part of reconciliation. Okay, so given what we all know, and in fact some of the stuff that we consider here today, what else do you think might be done in this situation?
I don't see the reconciliation.
Well, okay, this, as I've already been mentioning, there's, for example, in the film, there's this very poignant episode where a white South African, his wife was killed in a movie theater. These 4 guys just burst into the theater and started machine gunning people, and all, the 4 people who did it were caught, and they're sitting there absolutely impassive. And this guy is just trying to get them to say, "Did you notice a woman in a white raincoat while you were shooting?" That's all he wanted them to say, and they were just looking at him. They didn't say anything. They were just doing the minimum. They admitted, "Yes, you caught us. We committed that act." Period. End of quote. So, I guess what I'm saying, it's amazing how well it worked on this very, very minimal admission. But think of how much more there is to do. I can think of a case where there was in 1 second, there was a case of a woman, a black woman in the South, I think it may have been Florida. Her son was lynched by 2 white boys. This is in my book. And in court, one of those boys broke down and said to the woman, I just hope that someday you find it in your heart to forgive me. And she said, "Son, I've already forgiven you." That's where we want to get to. And incidentally, the reason that I'm talking about the TRC system is because up to a point, it has the wherewithal for being principled nonviolence, because forgiveness is very hard. Ask Arby, who's working on stuff like this. If you can bring yourself to forgive someone who has wronged you in a very serious way, who really dehumanized you, you've done emotionally what you need to do to engage principled nonviolence. So the question that I'm proposing that we consider is, okay, most of the time in this course we're talking about people who got the structure and the behaviors without the emotional energy. So here it looks like here's a case where we mostly have the emotional energy. We've got people to do this. And incidentally, there are systems that do it a lot better, and mostly indigenous ones, like the Gacaca court systems in sub-Saharan Africa, that do this a lot better. But I'm just saying, in these cases where it seems to be intersecting with the industrialized world, we have people who have gone through the spiritual conversion that you need to do to furnish the good energy to run the nonviolent machine. But they haven't thought a lot about how to build the machine, put the filters in, how to gear it up, and make it, there I go again, dehumanizing everything. Okay, so I think it was Matt, Seishi, and Paulo.
Yeah, just in Chile, after
Yeah.
Pinochet was opposed in the early 90s.
Yeah, that's another place.
Yeah, there are different presidential commissions
Yeah.
set up, but the military still had a very strong role in
Yeah.
controlling politics in the country.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until later into the 90s, different presidents set up different
Yeah.
commissions based in part on
Yeah.
what they were doing in South Africa. And the first one they did was to address the murders and
Disappearances.
so that families could know what happened. And
Yeah.
So there were around 3,000 people who just sort of disappeared in Chile. And because it was very centralized in Chile, as opposed to Argentina, there
Yeah.
were various generals who were carrying out the work in Chile. It was very centralized, so they had the records, and so the generals ended up coming forward and
Yeah.
kind of publicly, letting people know,
Yeah.
what happened to
Yeah.
various people disappeared. And then later on, around 2000 and 2006, when Ricardo Lagos was in office, by that time, a lot of the people like Pinochet appointed who were in government and started retiring more or less.
Yeah.
He set up a commission where whoever was kidnapped and tortured or other political prisoners, they could come forward and tell their story.
Uh-huh.
And then the commission officially would recognize these people.
Uh-huh.
It was between 25,000 or 30,000 of these political prisoners, and everyone got this number.
Yeah.
And Lagos in his talks on campus last semester said it was really like an affirming thing in Chilean society.
Yeah.
That people would tell their number to other
Yeah.
people. That was like part of their identity.
Then it's like people showing their stenciled on numbers from the Holocaust.
And one of the people was Michelle Bachelet, who's
Yeah.
now the president, first
Yeah.
female president of Chile.
Yeah.
So just having her as president is a
Yeah.
really strong role in office, and she's trying to carry
Yeah.
the reconciliation
Yeah.
commission even further to have military people meet with
Yeah.
families.
So that really is like victim offender reconciliation. It finally worked its way up to that situation through several stages that were not sufficient. And the issue often was, all over Latin America, the issue was having to choose between justice and reconciliation, because the army that carried this stuff out, at the time that they did it, they had convinced themselves, and everybody told them and paid them and patted them on the back for defending the country against communism or whatever it is, and then suddenly to turn around and say, okay, you have risked your life doing this horrible stuff, and now we're going to blame you for it, that was unacceptable to them, and they still had enough power to not go along with it. So the people who had been victimized, and the public in general who sympathized with them, needed to renounce the revenge, the accounting. They needed to renounce the calling these people to account in order to get the stories out into the public. That often was it. So that was that is a real spiritual renunciation that people had to make. Okay, I am in a position where I could blame you for what you've done to my family or my people or whatever, and I'm not going to do that so that we can get back together. What else is integrative power? And it's interesting how they went step by step towards building up to this.
One thing is
Mhm.
now in the Justice Department, because the Supreme Court justices that Pinochet appointed,
Mhm.
it's been over 15 years since
Mhm.
that office, that a lot of them are retiring, a lot of judges, and
Yeah.
so now there's actually a lot of civil suits filed against
Yeah.
people for
Yeah.
ostensible
Yeah.
offenses.
Yeah. Well, as I think I've mentioned, we had a chairman of Peace and Conflict Studies at one time who had been in the state Supreme Court, and he had actually gone down to Argentina and Chile, and while the torturing was still going on, and he was famous enough to make public statements and bring attention to it. He was an incredibly courageous guy. He said we should renounce punitive measures altogether, and well, the only thing we could do is reparations. If people have bombed $1 billion out of your country, they have to pay $1 billion. Or if they've stolen it, they have to give it back, as you would in any civil arrangement. But holding this threat of punishment over people has extremely limited usefulness. Usually it backfires. Just a second, Seishi?
I was going to say that I think in agriculture, the most important thing is to
you mind if I repeat what you're saying? Because otherwise it doesn't get onto the camera. No, I'm going to repeat it, Stacey, so that it gets onto the camera. What Stacey is saying is that in African countries, the most important thing is that when there's been an offense, to get the people at least to talk. Go ahead.
So for that reason, the commission has helped people who cannot, at least talk to each other.
Yeah.
They use the commission to at least speak
Yeah.
and get out of themselves.
Yeah.
These crimes, and even if it does not help them to reconcile, at least they feed them.
Yeah.
Level.
Yeah.
And if they don't,
Yeah.
it's
This is a very
open, they don't want to speak.
Yeah, very interesting point. So the commission becomes a third party, and where people cannot talk directly to one another and can't really reconcile on the level of relationship, at least, and this is a big at least they get this crime out of their system. And the victims get the anger and the grief and the resentment to some degree out of their system by being able to talk to someone in a structured relationship where it has some connection with the other party.
And I noticed that it was getting moving to see many people crying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saved by the crime.
Yeah.
And at that point, they did not do that.
Yeah.
They knew that they did not feel when they were committing a crime.
Yeah.
And just the person who had been victim that maybe did not know that he was right.
Yeah. Yeah. So during the act of violence, something happens to us and we don't feel what we're doing, and you create a situation where they can suddenly feel what they had done, but not in a way that's going to devastate them, and it's very moving to see them crying when this happens, and that sends a message to the victim, that an acknowledgement that you realize what you've done. Incidentally, this has been tried in 2-3 different ways around the Balkan countries also, and one of the tricks that they've come up, that's not a good word, one of the methods that they've come up with to get the conversation going is, the same thing with Israeli kids and Palestinian kids, you can come here and say what has been done to you, you cannot say this is what you did to me. Right? This is not going to personalize the crime, not going to point a finger or blame, and this is our old thing, you're against the thing, not the person. You can bare your heart about all the evils that happened to you, as long as you don't suddenly turn and say, you did this to me. It's that person who did it to you, it's his responsibility to own it, to step forward and say, yes, this happened to me, I was caught up in this and such happened. Yeah. Okay, Paolo and then Arby?
I think that the comment from the other station said is very interesting, and as we analyzing Africa, which is my concentration, I found that there are many other methods, many other countries that utilize a very similar system. We have the Kachacha, as you mentioned, Rwanda. Also, North Uganda has a very similar system for not only reconciliation with the victim and the perpetrator, but the whole community.
Okay.
Welcomes back.
Yeah, hang on one second. I just want to repeat what Paolo was saying. That there's an issue here that's been successful in some African countries of not just reconciling the victim and the offender, which we've been talking about, but to heal the whole community, bring everybody back together around it. Because we started off by saying that one of the differences between our retributive system and a hope for restorative system is that in the retributive system, the state owns the crime. So, but we're now going about it the other way. The individuals own the crime, but the community has to come in on the reconciliation. Go ahead.
And trying to answer the question I posted a few minutes ago, what is missing?
Yeah, what's missing?
In the TRC, what I always wonder is what happens after. Is there any follow-up? And interestingly, for most people, I like to focus more on the perpetrator because I do acknowledge the victims as well, but these people, it's very hard for them as well to come back to society and be productive instead of, well, they are bad and let's ignore them. So I always wonder, that's a great way of trying to get back, but what else?
Okay, well, so you're bringing my question back to me. What else? What can we do? Does anybody spot it on the basis of what we've been saying here so far today? It's very dramatic because we have like 15 seconds. Yeah.
Again, I would say, as you mentioned earlier, it's up to the teacher
The perpetrator?
to have the healing process. Because
Yeah.
you used to tell the victim what he done.
Yeah.
Most of the time, he or she's okay. It's true that if you don't, show, any emotion of what he done,
Yeah.
and you don't feel like you don't want to become friends with that victim again, you don't have it.
It won't happen, yeah.
But if the victim want to really become a sure, after you say it again, the victim is ready to accept
Yeah.
it again.
So if I could paraphrase what you're saying, like, oddly enough, though it shouldn't be so strange to us, the victim has less of a problem than the perpetrator. This is perpetration-induced traumatic stress all over again. If you get the perpetrator healed and reconciled with the community, it's going to be harder than helping the victim. In most cases, I mean, sometimes the crime can be so horrific that it's traumatizing for life. But okay, in the last, 10 seconds ago, it was all over. But I have to say, think of the Sharif and Sharif experiment. To get people to do something together, build something together, if not, possibly even physical. I remember being in Atlanta one time, and 4 kids had burned down a black church, and they were charged with the judge of rebuilding that church. So feeling it is the good first step, but then you have to actually put it in practice in some way, I think, to cement it. Okay, have a good weekend, everybody.